Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the second round of the Blitzfuel Invitational, which is taking place in New York City. Now, the famous YouTuber and aspiring Grandmaster candidate, Levy Rosman, is back in action. He had a mishap yesterday. He played a great game in the opening phase, should have won in the first round, but ultimately his opponent, Pedro Espinoza, played very, very well, found some resourceful moves, and was able to make a draw. Nonetheless, Levy moves on to the second round, and he's playing against a very talented junior player, Ryan Sun, who is currently the #2 ranked player in America for the age 13 and younger. So Levy is the white pieces playing against Ryan Sun, who is rated 2268, and let's jump right into the action. So Levy starts out with the move d4. We get knight f6, c4, e6, and here Levy plays knight f3. Now, Levy has played many systems. He's played the counterlands with g3. He decides in this game he wants to play knight f3 instead. We get the move d5, and now we have this unusual move queen c2. Now, queen c2 is not a bad move or anything, even though you can tell from the evaluation bar the advantage is very minimal. In fact, it's actually saying black is better here, but this is not a crazy move, and I think the reason Levy played this move is because he's playing a junior player who's very talented, but he also wants to avoid a bunch of theory. So if you were to take on d5 here, for example, you could still play queen c2 or knight c3. But I think when he goes queen c2, he's hoping that his young opponent is going to immediately go for something that is outside of his theory or his knowledge base and make a mistake. So his opponent plays knight bd7. Keep in mind that probably against knight c3, knight bd7 is the move that Ryan Sun intended to play. So he decides to play the same setup with knight bd7 anyway. Levy trades on d5, and now he plays move bishop to f4, targeting the pawn on c7. Ryan plays move c6, Levy plays move e3, and now we get this move knight h5. Now, Levy probably spent a bit of time here debating whether to play a move like e3 or knight c3, or whether to play the move h3 here. Now, when you put the bishop on f4 very early in the game, you're trying to play it a little bit like a London system potentially, and as most of you guys who have probably seen videos on the London system know, you always are looking to play h3 so that knight h5 is never an idea, because you can retreat this bishop to h2. Levy decides to play e3. I think when Levy played this move, he assumed that h3 was maybe a little bit too slow. Perhaps he's afraid of knight e4 and bishop b4 or systems along these lines. So he goes e3. We get knight to h5. Levy plays bishop g5. And now we get the move bishop e7. Levy trades the bishops and plays the move knight to c3. And now we get this move knight b6. Now, this position is a very stable position for both sides here. We have a very simplified center. Black has this pawn chain from b7 to d5. White has a pawn chain from f2 to d4. And this is what is known as the Carlsbad pawn structure. Here we get the move h3 from Levy. Ryan Sun plays g6, Levy goes g4, and now we get to move knight g7. Now, the reason that Levy is expanding on the king side so rapidly with h3 and g4 is that his idea here is to castle his king to the queen side. So we get the move bishop to d3. You also will notice here that by playing h3 and g4, Levy has this nice wooden shield on d3, which is unopposed. If you were to play a move like bishop d3, knight g7 and castles, perhaps here it does work. Black could play bishop to f5, and after takes, now we play a game of D's knights here with no bishops on the board. So back to the game. After bishop to d3, you'll notice that black cannot play the move bishop to f5 here because of the pawn on g4, so we get the move h5. Now, the computer does not like this move. It actually prefers the move bishop to e6, and the reason is that after, let's say, castles, if white ever plays the move knight to e5, black can go f6, kicking the horse back, and knight takes pawn is not an option as black wins the horse. So when we get this move h5, Levy castles, and now we have this move bishop e6. If black were to try and grab the pawn here with takes, and bishop takes g4, there's the move rook to h8 check, king to d7, and now white can trade the towers and play knight to e5, forking the king and the bishop and winning material. Therefore, Ryan Sun plays move bishop e6, and now Levy jumps to the center with the horse on e5. Now, the reason the computer is giving Levy an advantage here is that black no longer has the option to try and kick the horse with this f6 move, because since you have moved this pawn to h5, now this pawn on g6 falls, and you lose some material once again. So because the pawn is on h5, black has no good way to kick the knight out from e5, and at this point, Levy has a very pleasant advantage. So we get to move castles. Levy plays f4 here. Now we get to move bishop to d7. This is a move that I kind of don't really understand from Ryan's son here. I thought he should probably play king b8 with the idea of retreating the bishop to c8 in one go, because as we will see later, this bishop is simply going to waste time going to d7 and c8 in a couple of turns rather than in one move. So we get to move bishop d7. Levy plays move king b1, king b8, and now we get this move f5. Now, this move f5 is a very double-edged move in the position, because once you play f5, after the pawn trade occurs, there's no longer this weakness on g6. So let's just say black were able to get rook e8 and then f6 here. Now you can put the knight on g6, but it's simply guarded by the pawn. You're not capturing any material, and black can take the pawn on e3, and black is just much better. So it's a very double-edged move for that reason, that black can try to go f6 now, but also this pawn on f5 can become a weakness down the road. So we get the move knight to e8, a nice move here. You look at this knight on g7, not very active. You can't take the pawn. You can't go to e6. h5 is in a square. So when you go to e8, now you can put the knight on d6 or f6 as well. Levy plays move queen to h2. Now we get to move king to a8. Levy plays queen f4, and here we get to move queen f6. Now the computer hates this move, but it's actually a move that makes a lot of sense to me from a human perspective, because the only other way that you stop white from pushing this pawn is to put the knight on f6. But after queen to h4, there can potentially be a very nasty pin. There's also rook hg1 trying to go for rook g7, and you feel like you're under quite a bit of pressure. Additionally, if you play a move like bishop c8, just to illustrate the point, white always has the option of trying to play f6, because after takes and rook f1, there is potentially a lot of pressure on the knight and the pawn as well. So you get the move queen to f6. Now Levy plays move e4, and this is a move that is actually good, but I really dislike it for one simple reason, which is that after you play the move e4, you're putting your opponent in a situation where he does not have many options. Now you probably are thinking, well, what do I mean by he doesn't have many options? All the pieces on the board, everything is normal. Now, as you improve at chess, you become a better player. There are certain things you will notice about pawn structure specifically and where pieces belong. And the reason that I don't like this move e4 is that if black were to take, for example, after knight takes e4, if you take on f5, white can move the queen here. Rook is under pressure. There are all kinds of fossils looming. There's even rook to f1 as well, and black is in a lot of trouble. So black can't really take this pawn. But the second point is that if you look at the pawn structure here, if black plays a move like, let's just say a6, white can trade the knight for the bishop and go for the structure with e5 and something like rook hg1. And at this point, black is in a lot of trouble here, primarily because you look at white's pawns, there's a big white center. These knights are very, very passive here, so only white can have the advantage. So as long as you understand the pawn structure like Levy's opponent Ryan's son does, you're going to play the move bishop c8, because otherwise white will trade and push the p to e5. So we get bishop c8. Levy plays rook hf1 here, and now we get the move rook to g8. Logical move as well, as black claims the open g file for the rook. Now here Levy plays move a4, and this is a move that unfortunately once again really forces the issue. What Levy probably should have played in this position was taken on d5 right away, and after takes, there's the move rook to c1 here. And if black were to play a move like a6, white can play rook to c5, lining up the double stack with rook to c1, pressuring the bishop, but also pressuring this pawn on d5. So after rook c1, if black plays move knight to d6, now white can go rook to c7, creating the kebab on the 7th rank. And black is actually struggling in this position, as the knight is kind of stuck on d6. Bishop on c8 has no scope on the diagonal, and white definitely is much better. But when Levy plays a4 here, his opponent does not have options once again, because if you go knight d7, for example, white will trade and go e5, and we reach the same structure where the pawns are very advanced and black's bishop and the knight are extremely passive. So you can't really go knight to d7. If you try to play a5, stopping white from pushing the pawn to harass the knight, now white can play queen d2, spying this pawn on a5, and most likely white is going to win the game, or win the pawn, I should say, in a couple of turns. So you can't really play a5 here. You can't really play knight d7, which means that you force your opponent to play pawn takes pawn, which, by the way, is the absolute best move in the position. Now, it's not a move necessarily that you would consider as the first option, because after takes, knight takes, and queen e7, you might see the boogeyman with something like f6 here, and you worry about the pawn, you worry about the knights jumping, and it feels like you could be in trouble. But when you're in this situation here and your opponent is forcing you to play it and you have no other options, then you will be forced to calculate this line and indeed play it. So we get pawn takes pawn. Whoops, I actually hit the forward button. Sorry about that. That was weird. And here Levy plays the move bishop takes pawn. Now, Levy could have played the move knight takes pawn here, but after queen to e7, f6, and now this move queen to c7, black is actually a little bit better because you have a weak pawn on d4, and black is also jumping to the center of the board with knight to d5. So, Levy plays bishop takes pawn. Now we get to move knight to d6, another move which is pretty much forced here, because if you were to play a5 trying to stop white, again there are going to be issues with things like d5 opening up the diagonals. Even queen to d2 here potentially causes black serious issues, so it's very, very hard to play that. So you're going to be forced to play knight d6 because now the knight targets the pawn and the bishop, and your knight can jump to the center. Levy goes a5, and of course we get this move knight to d5, only move again, because if you play knight d7 here, white can go a6, undermining your pawn chain here, and the black king is very, very weak on the long light square diagonal. So we get the move knight to d5. Levy decides to trade, and here he plays move bishop takes pawn. We get queen takes pawn, and at this point we're headed towards an endgame, it would seem, with even material. Now, this is where Levy decides to play the move king to a1, and this is actually a surprisingly serious mistake here. I suspect that Levy kind of fell asleep at the wheel in this game, and he thought that at this point there was nothing wrong. Queens were going to be traded on f4, and the game would peter out to a draw. What I do think Levy should have played was something like queen takes queen, bishop takes, and then this move king to a1. And even though you lose the pawn on h3 here, now you can play rook to h1, bishop g4, and after rook d to f1 here, you're going to win this pawn on f7, and this is leading towards a position which probably should be a draw. So we get this move king to a1 instead, and now Ryan's son plays move queen c2, and this is an excellent decision here. He does not trade the queens and make a draw. He realizes that the white king is now a big target because you push your p up to a5, but the queen can now start harassing the king on the a file. And when you look at the weak pawn on h3, the weak pawn on a5, the pressure on the d file, and the open g file, black has serious counterplay here, and there are very decent chances to confuse the matter and win the game. Now, to make matters even worse, when we look at this position, Levy is already down 11 minutes on the clock here, and things are starting to go in the wrong direction. So Levy plays rook d3 here with the idea that after check, we get to move rook to a3, stopping the queen from capturing the pawn or checking the king. Now we get the move queen to b5, and here Levy plays the move bishop a2. Now, another issue in general, even at this point in the game, is that when white goes bishop a2, if you look at this position, there are just not a lot of options for black. You'll notice the pawn on f7 is weak. In this position, you can't really move the knight or the bishop, but the one thing you have here is you have an open file. So, of course, Ryan's son plays rook g2, threatening the checkmate on b2, and now Levy makes an epic fail with the move rook f1. That's really hard to critique Levy for this move. He's way down on time, as you can see. He's at 4 minutes. It's a serious situation, but this move does effectively lead to a situation where you are completely lost objectively. What Levy should have played was the move queen to c1 here, guarding the pawn and the rook at the same time. If black plays the move rook takes b2, for example, white can play knight takes f7, and after takes, white is still very much in the game. The king looks a little bit weak on a1, but there is even material on the board. Instead, Levy goes rook b1. Now we get the move bishop f5, and it's really, really time for spaghetti-o, as the rook is under attack. If you move the rook, you get mated in uno. So at this point, it looks like you're going to lose some material. So Levy goes queen to f1 here, offering the trade of the queens and targeting the rook on g2 at the same time. Now, this is where, with Levy having a minute 41 on the clock and his opponent Ryan's son having 15 minutes, sometimes it's really important to use your time, because in this moment, if Ryan's son used his time here and played the move rook d to g8, stacking the tower so the rook can't be captured, I firmly believe Levy would have lost this game within the next couple of moves, because if you trade the queens here, now both of D's rooks are under attack, so you'll lose one of the rooks on b1 or a3. And if you play a move like rook to b3, for example, black can simply trade the queens, and in this position, there's rook to g1. You can't trade, because then you would end up losing your bishop on a2, which has to block. And when you play this move rook to f3, black can now go bishop takes h3 here, and everything is collapsing for the player with the white pieces. But Ryan's son tries to get a little bit fancy here. He plays a move that is not necessarily bad per se, but it's a move after which Levy is able to get into an endgame. Now, when we talk about time usage here, it is important, because sometimes even if you see a move that is good, if your opponent is low on time the way Levy is here, sometimes you want to keep it complicated. Try to keep all the pieces on the board, because after the move rook takes b2, which is a really cool move to play here, now Levy can trade the queens. Now, if Levy takes the rook on b2, then you lose the queen on f1 and you lose the game. But Levy can trade the queens, and now he plays this great move knight takes f7. Now, everything is hanging here. The rook is under attack. This rook is under attack. However, as you can tell from the valuation bar, the computer thinks that Levy is okay. So we get bishop takes rook, Levy takes rook, we get takes, and now we get this move a6. The dust has settled somewhat. Levy is down 10 minutes on the clock here, but at least it is an endgame. That being said, it's still very, very tough to play here because black has 2 connected pawns on the queen side, and this pawn on a5 is a serious target. So Levy plays move knight to e6. We get the move rook to b3, and now Levy plays this move knight to f4. Here his opponent plays knight to b5, and this is another excellent decision from Ryan's son because you're probably thinking, well, take this pawn, keep the game going. But after knight takes h5, we see one of the rarest checkmates, one of the rarest checkmate setups in the game of chess, where black can go knight c3, setting up the Arabian checkmate. The idea is simply that you want to go rook to b1, mating the king in the corner. So if white tries to play rook b2, stopping the mate, now you check here, white has to block, and after rook a2, once again, we get the Arabian checkmate. So after knight b5, Levy plays the move rook to b2. We get the move rook a3, and now Levy plays king b1. Now this move is a serious mistake here. Levy should have played the move rook to a2. Probably he was worried about rook to f3, after which he's in significant trouble. But this would have been a little bit better because after king to b1, now Ryan is able to take the juicer on a5. Black has 2 connected pawns on the queen side, and white cannot take the pawn on h5 because after knight to a3, you check the king and attack the knight, creating fossil number 1. If you move over, you lose the knight in the game. And if you play the move king to a2, now there is knight to c4, creating fossil number 2, where you attack the rook and check the king at the same time. So we get this move rook to d2 from Levy. Ryan plays knight a3, king c1, rook f5, and now Levy goes knight e6. Here we get the move knight c4. Levy plays rook d3. We get rook f2, and now Levy pushes his p with d5. Here we get the move knight to d6, and at this point Levy is down 1 pawn, but surprisingly it's kind of hard for black to push the pawns on the queen side. Just to give you a sample idea here, if you get something like a5 for example, black can play rook to a3, b6, and after rook c3, suddenly there's infiltration on the c file here for the rook, and white is very much back in the game. Levy instead decides to play the move knight g7. Now we get this move h4, and after this move, all of us who are watching this game live started to think that Levy was very likely going to draw the game because he plays the move rook to d4, and suddenly black, who has the active rook here, is going to have to go passive with the rook in order to not lose the pawn. Now, what I would have probably recommended here if I were playing this game is I would have already been considering ideas like king to a7 and king b6, or even already just b5, knight h5, and a5, just trying to use my 2 connected pawns, push them up the board as quickly as possible. If you can start pushing your p, that gives you great chances to win in the endgame. So instead we get h4, rook d4. Now we have rook f7, knight e6, rook h7, Levy plays king c2, and now we get the move king a7. Now, the reason I talk about the active versus passive rook here is that the rook on h7 is kind of stuck guarding the pawn. You don't really have lateral movement. If you ever move off the file, you will simply, I guess it's white's move. So if you ever move the rook off the file, you'll lose the pawn on h4. So the rook doesn't have lateral movement here from side to side, and it's simply stuck guarding the pawn. So white's knight and rook are a little bit more active. The king is also a bit more active in the center of the board as well. So we get king a7. Levy plays knight g5, we get rook g7, knight e6, rook h7 back, knight g5, and now we have the move rook h5. Here Levy plays knight to f3, trying to win this pawn on h4. Now, the best way to play this position, by the way, after rook h7 here is to play the move rook to g4. And the reason for this is that this move puts the rook on an open file, but it also creates a pathway for the white king to move up the board. So after, say, king b6, king c3, and a5, now white can potentially play king d4 and king e5 here to try and attack the knight and start pushing the d-pawn up the board. So we get knight f3. Now we have the move knight f5 here. Levy plays rook e4, and here we get the move king b6. Now at this point, if Levy had played the move king to d3 here, there is no doubt in my mind that he would have drawn this game, for the very simple fact that in this position, if black doesn't move this knight, let's say black plays a move like a5, white can go rook to e5, pinning the knight on f5 here, and after black plays a move like knight g3, you simply trade the towers, take the pawn, and after knight f4, king c4 takes, and something like knight to f5 here, this position with knight f4 and knight to d6 should be a draw, even though you're down a pawn, because one of the cool ideas here is you can sack the knight, move the king, win the last pawn, and save the game. Unfortunately, Levy plays the wrong order here. He goes rook to e5, and the problem with this move is that he forces his opponent to find the only winning move here, and it's not a hard move. Now, as I mentioned before, you're pinning the knight on f5. So, of course, you're never going to play knight g3 here, but there is the tactic with knight to d4, checking the king here. White cannot capture the horse because then you lose the rook and you lose the game. So Levy has to go king d3. Now we get the trade and the move king c5. And really the issue is all these decisions by Levy have forced his opponent to really find a very simple move that someone who is even maybe 1700 probably should find. So Levy goes king e4 here. Now we get to move knight to e2. Levy plays knight to f3. And now we get knight c3, king e5, knight takes pawn, knight takes h4. And here we have the move a5. Now, as you can tell from the valuation bar, Ryan is starting to push his p. Levy's knight is offside. So it becomes a question of, will these two juicers be quicker than this h-pawn getting up the board? Levy goes knight f3. We get a4, knight d2, a3, check, king c4. And now the move knight a1. Now here, rather inexplicably, Ryan's son plays move knight to e3, and this is a situation where when you have 5 minutes and 8 seconds versus 1 minute 19 seconds, you should use your time to calculate, because this is a situation where it is a clear, pure pawn race. Now what I mean by that here is that there are two ways for black to win this pawn race. The first one is to play a2 right away, and after h4, b5, h5, b4, h6, b3, h7, b2. If white tries the queen, black captures the knight with check and skewers this king on the diagonal. You win the queen and the game. The second way to win this is, instead of a2, you can also play the other one with b5, h4, b4, h5, b3, h6, b2, knight c2, and now you play the move a2, and after h7, you can just queen the pawn, white queens, you queen, and after takes, you're in the same situation where the king is getting skewered, and you win the queen on the diagonal. So with 5 minutes and 8 seconds, it would have been really smart for Ryan to use a little bit of time to calculate it, because this is an outside h-pawn going up the board. And if you are fast enough with b5, b4, b3, b2, you just win the game. There are no ifs, ands, or buts to it. You simply win the game. But instead, we get to move knight to e3. And now Levy plays h4. We get king c3. And Levy, of course, pushes his pawn to h5. Now, this is where Ryan's son plays move knight to g4. And Levy goes king to f4. Now, it would have been really interesting to see what would have happened in the game if Levy had played the move king to f5. Because after knight to h6, king g6 here, black only has one way to win the game. I guess it's the same thing in a different order. But the only way to win the game is to play either a2 or king b2. It will transpose. Let's say king b2. And after takes, king g6, black pushes, white pushes, you go over, white pushes, and black queens the pawn first and wins the game. The main reason I mentioned this line specifically is because after knight to g8 here, if white goes king g7 and black plays knight e7, king f7, knight f5, and king g6, this is actually a theoretical draw, as you can tell from the valuation bar. So Levy plays king f4 instead, and now after knight h6, king g5, Ryan's son plays move knight g8. Now, would he have played the same move with the king on g6? We will never know the answer to the question, but with the king on g5 unable to jump to g7 in one turn, now Levy is simply dead lost, because when if he ever goes to h6, black sacks the knight, goes king b2 to win the knight and push p. And if you play the move king to g6 here, after king b2, king g7, takes, a2, we're in the same situation, h6, king b1, h7, queen, you trade the queens, you push the pawn, and now the black pawn is way too far up the board, and you simply move the king, get a queen, and win in a very elementary fashion. So it's really a tragedy that Levy played king to f4 here. If he had gone king to f5, it would have been really interesting to see if we would have gotten the right line with king to b2, or whether his young opponent would have played the move knight g8, making a huge mistake and drawing the game. At any rate, Levy put the king on f4. So after the move knight to g8, Levy resigns the game. A very disappointing game for Levy. Very tough game, of course. His opponent made very few mistakes, I would say, overall. There were mistakes in the end game when they were low on time, but his opponent played a pretty clean game. And so for Levy, he suffers a tough loss. He moves to half a point out of 2 now. Not the start he was hoping for. He's starting to lose some rating points, but it is still a long tournament. There are still 7 more games to go. So let's wait and see how Levy does in the remainder of the games. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the second round of the Blitzfuel Invitational being held in New York City. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with a recap after Levy plays in the third round of this I Am Norm event. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you very soon. Have a good one. Bye.